Hello, and welcome to Story Time. I'd like you to sit back, relax, and listen. Viscount Breckenridge to the Rescue, written by Stephanie Lawrence. Chapter 1, March 1829, Wadham Gardens, London. Heather Sinster knew her latest plan to find a suitable husband was doomed the instant she set foot into Lady Hertford's salon. In a distant corner, a dark head, perfectly coiffed in the latest rakish style, rose. A pair of sharp hazel-eyed pinned her where she stood. Damn. Keeping a smile firmly fixed over her involuntarily clenched teeth, as if she hadn't noticed the most startlingly handsome man in the room, staring so intently at her, she let her gaze drift on. Breckenridge was hemmed in by not one, but three dashing ladies, all patiently vying for his attention. She sincerely wished them every success and prayed he'd take the sensible course and pretend he hadn't seen her. She was certainly going to pretend she hadn't seen him, refocusing on the surprisingly large crowd. Lady Hertford had enticed her to her Sawyer. Heather determinedly banished Breckenridge from her mind and considered her prospects. Most of the guests were older than she, all the ladies at least. Some she recognized, others she did not. But it would be surprising if any other lady present wasn't married, or widowed, or more definitely on the shelf than Heather. Sawyers of the style of Lady Hertford's were primarily the province of the well-bred but bored matrons, those in search of more convivial company than that provided by their usual, more older, more sedated husbands. Such ladies might not be precisely fast, yet neither they innocent. However, as by common accord, said ladies had already presented their husbands with heirs, if not two. The majority had more years in their dish than Heather's 25. From her brief initial assessing sweep, she concluded that most of the gentlemen present were, encouragingly, older than she. Most were in their 30s, and by their style fashionable, well turned out, expensively garbed, and thoroughly polished. She'd chosen well in making Lady Hertford Sawyer her first port of call on this. Her first expedition outside the rarefied confines of the ballrooms, drawing rooms, and dining rooms of the upper echelon of the ton. For years she searched through those more refined reception rooms for her hero, the man who would sweep her off her feet into wedding bliss, only to conclude that he didn't even move in such circles. Many gentlemen of the ton, although perfectly eligible in every way, preferred to steer well clear of all the sweet young things the young ladies paraded on the marriage mart. Instead, they spent their evenings at events such as Lady Hertford's, and the nights in various pursuits, gaming, womanizing, to name but two. Her hero, she had to believe he existed somewhere, was most likely a member of that more elusive group of males. Given he was therefore unlikely to come to her, she decided, after lengthy and animated discussions with her sisters, Elizabeth and Angelica, that it behooved her to come to him, to locate him, and if necessary, hunt him down. Smiling ambly, she descended the shallow steps to the floor of the saloon. Lady Hertford's villa was recently built, quite luxuriously dwelling located to the north of Primrose Hill, close enough to the Mayfair to be easily reached by carriage, or pertinent consideration given Heather had to come alone. She would have preferred to attend with someone to bear her company, but her sister Eliza, such a year younger, and similarly disgusted with the lack of hero material within their restricted circle, was her most likely conspiration and conspirator, and they could both develop a headache on the same evening without their mamma seeing through the ploy. Eliza, therefore, was presently gracing Lady Montgal's ballroom, while Heather was supposedly lay upon her bed, safe and snug in Dover Street, giving every appearance of calm confidence. Attention, although the pretended obliviousness she could feel the assessing glances dwelling on the sleek amber silk gown that clung levelly to her curves. This particular creation sported a sweetheart neckline and a tiny puff sleeves. As the evening was unsensibly mild and her carriage stood outside, she elected to carry only a fine topaz and amber Norwich silk shawl and a fringe draping over her bare arms and flirting over the silk of the gown. Her advanced age allowed her greater freedom to wear gowns that, while definitely not as revealing as some others, she could see nevertheless drew male eyes. One gentleman, suitably drawn and touch bolder than his fellows, broke from the circle surrounding two ladies, and languidly stepped into her path. Halting, she haughtily arched a brow. He smiled and bowed, fluidly graceful. "Miss Sinster, I believe." "Indeed, sir, and you are?" "Miles Furlow, my dear." His eyes met hers as he straightened. "Is this your first time here?" "Yes." She glanced around, determined, projecting confidence and assurance. She intended to pick her man, not allow him or any other to pick her. The company appears quite animated. The noise of untold conversations was steadily rising. Returning her gaze to Miles Furlow, she asked, "Are her ladyship's gatherings customarily so lively?" Furlow's lips curved in a smile Heather wasn't sure she liked. "I think you'll discover," Furlow broke off, his gaze going past her. She had an instant warning, a primitive prickling over her nape. Then long, stealing fingers closed around her elbow. Heat washed over her, emanating from the contact, supplanted almost instantly by disorientation guidiness. She caught her breath. She didn't need to look to know that Timothy Danvers, Viscount Breckenridge, her nemesis, had elected not to be sensible. Furlow, the deep voice issuing from her head to the side and usually disconcerting her effects. Ignoring the frisson of awareness streaking down her spine, a susceptibility she positively despised, she slowly turned her head and directed a raining glare, as in to cause Breckenridge. There was nothing to her tone to suggest she welcomed his arrival. Quiet, the opposite. He ignored her attempt to depress his pretensions. Indeed, she wasn't even sure he registered it. His gaze hadn't shifted from Furlow. "If you'll excuse us, old man, there's a matter I need to discuss with Miss Sinster." Breckenridge held Furlow's gaze. "I'm sure you understand." Furlow's expression suggested that he didn't yet wished he didn't feel obliged to give away. But in this milieu, Breckenridge, the hostess, and the lady's darling, was well nigh impossible to gainsay. Reluctantly, Furlow inclined his head. Of course." Shifting his gaze to Heather, Furlow smiled more sincerely and tad ruefully. "Miss Sinster, would we had met in less crowded surroundings, perhaps next time." With a parting nod, he sauntered off into the crowd. Heather let free of an exasperated huff. But before she could even gather her arguments and turn them on Breckenridge, he tightened his grip on her elbow and started propelling her through the crowd. Startled, she tried to halt. "What?" "If you have the slightest sense of self-preservation, you will walk to the front door without any fuss." He was steering her, superstitiously pushing her into that direction, and it wasn't all that far. "Let me go." She uttered the command, low and delivered, with considerable feeling through clenched teeth. He urged her up to the saloon steps, used the moment when she was on the step above him to bend his head and breathe in her ear. "What the devil are you doing here?" He clenched his teeth, trumped her clenched teeth. The words in his tone slid through her, evoking, as he'd no doubt intended, a nebulous, purely instinctive fear. By the time she shook free of it, he wasn't smoothly, apparently unhurriedly, steering her through the guests' throng and the foyer. "No, don't bother answering." He didn't look down. He had the open front door in his sights. I'm sorry, I lost my track. "I don't care what nightmarish notion you've taken into your head. You're leaving now." Hail, whole, virgin, intact. Yeah, Breckenridge only just bit back the words. "There is no reason whatever for you to interfere," her voice vibrating with barely suppressed fury. He recognized her mood well enough, her customary one whenever he was near. Normally, he would respond by giving her a wide berth. But here and now, he had no choice. "Do you have any idea what your cousins would do to me, let alone your brothers, if they discovered I'd seen you in this den of inequity and turned a blind eye?" She snorted and tried superstitiously, but unsuccessfully, to free her elbow. "You're as large as any of them, and demonstratively just as much of a bully. You could see them off." "One, perhaps, but all six? I think not. Let alone Luke and Martin and Giles Chillingsworth. And what about Michael? No, wait. What about Caro and your aunts? And the list goes on. Flaying would be preferable, much less pain." "You're overreacting. Lady Hedford's house hardly qualifies as a den of inequity." She glanced back. "There's nothing the least objectionable going on in that saloon." "Not in the saloon, perhaps. At least not yet. But you didn't go further into the house. Trust me, a den of inequity as it most definitely is." "But—" "No." Reaching the front door, thankfully deserted, he halted, released her, and finally let himself look down at her. Letting himself look her into the face, a perfectly oval, hosting delicate features, and a pair of stormy gray-blue eyes, lusciously fringed with dark brown lashes. Despite those eyes having turned hard and flinty, even though her luscious lips were presently compressed into a thin line, that face was the sort that had launched armadas and incident wars since the dawn of time. It was a face full of life, full of sensual promise, and barely restrained vitality. And that was before adding the effect of a slender figure, sleek rather than curvious, yet invested with such fluid grace in her every movement, evoked thoughts that, at least in his case, were better left unexplored. The only reason she hadn't been mobbed in the saloon was because none of the furlough had shaken free of the aristocratization, and for sight of her general caused quickly enough to get her before he had. He felt his face harden, fought not to clench his fists and tow her over to sure to be vain attempt to intimidate her. You're going home, and that's all there is to it. Her eyes narrowed to shards. And if you try to force me, I'll scream. He lost the battle. His fists clenched at his sides. Holding her gaze, evenly stated, If you do, I'll tap you under that pretty little chin, knock you unconscious, and tell everyone you fainted, toss you in a carriage, and send you home. Her eyes widened. She considered him, but didn't back down. You wouldn't. He didn't blink. Try me. Heather inwardly dithered. This was the most trouble with the Breckenridge. One simply couldn't tell what he was thinking. His face, that Greek god, all clean planes and sharp angles, lean cheeks, below and high cheekbones, and square jaw, remained aristocratically impassive and utterly unreadable. No matter what was going through his mind, not even his heavy-lidded hazel eyes gave any clue. His expression was primarily that of an elegant, rakish gentleman who cared for little beyond his intimidating pleasure. Every element of his appearance, from his exquisite, understanding attire, the severe cut of his clothes, making the lean strength they concealed only more apparent, the languid drawl he habitually affected, supporting that image, one she was fairly certain was a comprehensive facade. She searched his eyes and detected not the small sign that he wouldn't do precisely as he said, which would be simply so embarrassing. How did you get here? Reluctantly, she waved at the line of carriages stretching along the curving pavement at the Wadham Gardens as far as the eye could see. My parents' carriage, and before you lecture me on inappropriate properties of traveling across London alone at night, both the coachman and the groom have been in my family for decades. Tightly lipped, he nodded. I'll walk you to it. He reached for her elbow again. She whisked away. Don't bother. Frustration erupted. She felt sure he would inform her brothers, and he'd found her at the Lady Hereford's, which would spell an end to her plan, one which, until he interfered, had held real promise. She gave vent to her temper, an infuriated glare. I can walk 20 yards by myself. Even to her ears, her words sounded petulant. In reaction, she capped them with, Just leave me alone. Lifting her chin, she swung on her heels and marched down the steps. Headed determinedly high, she turned right along the pavement toward where her parents' town carriage waited in line. Inside, she felt childish and furious, helpless.